Rain hammered against the stained glass windows of the Harrison estate, but inside, the air was suffocatingly silent. 16-year-old Caleb stood shivering in the sprawling marble foyer, his only earthly possessions shoved into a frayed canvas backpack. His father, a titan of corporate industry, didn't even look up from his mahogany desk as he delivered the final life-shattering order, "You are no longer my son, get out." Thrown into the unforgiving streets without a dime or a lifeline, Caleb thought his life was over. He didn't know that exactly 10 years later, a single wax-sealed envelope from the man who destroyed him would change absolutely everything. The Harrison family resided in a sprawling, multi-million-dollar compound in Greenwich, Connecticut. To the outside world, Richard Harrison was a paragon of the American dream, a self-made logistics mogul who had built a billion-dollar empire from a single delivery truck. But behind the iron gates and manicured hedges of his estate, Richard was a ruthless dictator. A man who viewed his family not as loved ones, but as assets to be managed and liabilities to be mitigated. Caleb had always been the liability. He was the ghost of Richard's first wife, Catherine, a woman who had died of leukemia when Caleb was only 4. Caleb had her soft, empathetic eyes and her stubborn sense of justice, traits that deeply irritated his father. When Richard remarried a sharply ambitious socialite named Sylvia, the dynamic in the house shifted from coldly neglectful to actively hostile. Sylvia came with a son from a previous marriage, Derek, a boy exactly Caleb's age, but blessed with a silver tongue and a complete lack of moral boundaries. Sylvia made it her life's mission to ensure Derek was positioned as the sole heir to the Harrison dynasty, systematically painting Caleb as a troubled, rebellious degenerate in his father's eyes. The breaking point arrived on a violently stormy evening in late October. Caleb was in his room, struggling through a geometry assignment, when the screech of tires and a deafening crash echoed from the front courtyard. He sprinted downstairs and burst through the front doors into the freezing rain. There, crumpled against a centuries-old oak tree, was Richard's prized possession. A pristine, restored 1,967 Shelby GT 500. Stumbling out of the driver's side was Derek, reeking of expensive scotch, his designer shirt torn, and a hysterical laugh bubbling from his lips. "I clipped the gate," Derek slurred, leaning heavily against the wrecked chassis. "Old man's gonna kill me." Before Caleb could drag Derek inside, the front doors flew open again. Richard and Sylvia rushed out, illuminated by the harsh glare of the porch security lights. Richard's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage as he took in the ruined metal. "What did you do?" Richard bellowed, his voice cutting through the thunder. Derek, in a split second of sociopathic brilliance, pointed a shaking finger directly at Caleb. "He took the keys, Dad! I tried to stop him!" "He was drinking, I tried to pull the emergency brake, but he wouldn't listen." Caleb froze, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead. "What? No, he's lying. I was upstairs in my room." Sylvia immediately rushed to Derek, wrapping her cashmere shawl around his shoulders. "Look at my poor boy," she cried, feigning horror. "Richard, Caleb almost killed him. I told you he was spiraling out of control. I told you." "Dad, smell his breath," Caleb pleaded, stepping forward. "He's drunk. I don't even know how to drive a manual transmission." Richard didn't listen. He didn't investigate. He didn't even look at Derek. He marched forward, grabbed Caleb by the collar of his t-shirt, and violently shoved him backward onto the wet asphalt. "You ungrateful, destructive parasite," Richard spat, the venom in his voice making Caleb physically recoil. "Derek has early admission interviews for Yale next month. A DUI would ruin his future. Your future was already worthless, but I will not let you drag my family down into the gutter with you." "Dad, please, you can't believe them." "Shut up," Richard roared. He turned to the massive oak doors of the house. "Go upstairs. Pack a bag. You have 5 minutes before I call the police and tell them you stole my car and assaulted your brother." Caleb stared up at the man who had sired him, searching for even a flicker of paternal hesitation. There was nothing but calculating, glacial emptiness. Sylvia stood behind Richard, a tiny, triumphant smirk playing on her lips. Derek was suddenly completely silent, refusing to meet Caleb's eyes. 10 minutes later, Caleb walked down the long, winding driveway. He had a backpack containing 3 changes of clothes, a toothbrush, a photograph of his mother, and $42 in cash. He was 16 years old. He had no phone, no friends to call, and no shelter. As the iron gates clicked shut behind him, locking with a definitive metallic thud, Caleb didn't look back. The rain soaked through his thin jacket, chilling him to the bone, but an intense, burning fire had ignited in his chest. He was officially dead to the Harrison family, and he swore as he walked into the dark, relentless storm that he would never need them again. The first 3 months were a brutal masterclass in human invisibility. Caleb hitchhiked his way down the coast, ending up in the sprawling industrial belly of Baltimore. The transition from a mansion in Greenwich to the concrete underpasses of Maryland was terrifying. He learned how to sleep with his backpack tied to his leg to prevent it from being stolen. He learned which diners would let him sit in the back booth for the price of a single black coffee, and which alleys were safe from the nocturnal predators that stalked the city's vulnerable. He survived by washing dishes under the table, hauling construction debris, and doing whatever grueling, invisible labor the city demanded. The anger that had fueled his exit from the estate slowly calcified into a quiet, hardened resilience. He wasn't Caleb Harrison anymore. He went only by Caleb, dropping the surname as though it were a disease. His salvation came in the form of a rusted, sputtering 1998 Ford pickup truck. Caleb was 18, shivering outside a dilapidated auto repair shop on the edge of the city, trying to keep out of the biting January wind. An old man, covered in grease and sporting a magnificent, unruly white beard, was struggling to lift a heavy alternator out of the Ford's engine bay. The man was coughing violently, his hands shaking with exhaustion. Without a word, Caleb stepped forward, reached over the fender, and hoisted the heavy metal part out of the engine, setting it gently on the workbench. The old man wiped his forehead with a filthy rag, eyeing Caleb with a mixture of suspicion and gratitude. "You trying to steal my tools, kid?" "If I was going to steal," Caleb said, his voice raspy from the cold, "I'd steal something lighter. I'm just looking for work. I don't know much about cars, but I can lift things, and I work cheap." The man extended a calloused hand. "Arthur Pendleton. I run this miserable excuse for a garage. You sweep the floors, haul the scrap, and don't steal from the register. I'll pay you minimum wage and let you sleep on the cot in the back office." It was the closest thing to a miracle Caleb had ever experienced. Arthur's garage became Caleb's sanctuary. Arthur wasn't just a mechanic. He was a brilliant, stubborn engineer who had been pushed out of the corporate automotive world decades prior. Recognizing Caleb's sharp mind and desperate work ethic, Arthur began to teach him. He taught Caleb how an engine breathed, how to diagnose a transmission failure by sound alone, and how to weld a broken chassis back to structural integrity. More importantly, Arthur taught Caleb what it meant to be a man. There was no manipulation here, no psychological chess games. There was only the honest exchange of labor for survival. For the first time in his life, Caleb felt a sense of belonging. The years bled into one another. Caleb grew from a scrawny, frightened teenager into a broad-shouldered, quiet man. His hands were perpetually stained with motor oil, crisscrossed with tiny pale scars from slipped wrenches and hot exhaust pipes. At night, he devoured library books on business management and advanced mechanical engineering. He helped Arthur modernize the shop, bringing in more clients and keeping the lights on when the neighborhood began to gentrify. But life, as Caleb knew intimately, was rarely fair. When Caleb was 25, Arthur's persistent cough was diagnosed as late-stage lung cancer. The decline was rapid and agonizing. Caleb stayed by his side, feeding him, managing the garage, and holding his hand until the old man took his final, rattling breath. Arthur left the garage to Caleb. It was his only inheritance. But it came with a mountain of hidden medical debt and a second mortgage Arthur had taken out just to keep the business afloat during his treatments. Caleb was 26, working 80-hour weeks, drowning in debt, and struggling to save the only home he had ever known. It was on a humid Tuesday afternoon, while Caleb was underneath a rusted Chevy Silverado, that the past finally caught up with him. A pristine black Mercedes S-Class pulled into the cracked concrete lot of the garage, looking absurdly out of place among the rusted husks of broken cars. A man stepped out. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He carefully sidestepped a puddle of transmission fluid and walked into the open bay doors. "I'm looking for Caleb Harrison," the man said, his voice crisp and authoritative. Caleb slid out from under the truck on his creeper board, wiping grease from his forehead. He stared at the man, a cold dread pooling in his stomach. He hadn't heard that name in a decade. "Just Caleb," he corrected, standing up to his full 6'2" height, towering over the suited man. "Who's asking?" The man pulled a sleek leather portfolio from his briefcase. "My name is Benjamin Sterling. I am the senior partner at Sterling & Hughes and the executor of the Harrison family estate. I have been looking for you for 3 weeks." Caleb crossed his arms, his wrench still gripped tightly in his right hand. "You're wasting your time. I don't have anything to do with that family." Sterling adjusted his glasses, his expression entirely neutral. I'm afraid that is no longer entirely up to you, Caleb. Your father, Richard Harrison, suffered a massive myocardial infarction 4 days ago. He is dead." Caleb froze. The words hung in the muggy air, heavy and surreal. His father, dead. He waited for a wave of grief to hit him, for some buried childhood attachment to surface. But there was nothing. Just a hollow, echoing silence. "I don't care," Caleb said flatly, turning back toward the Chevy. "Buy a wreath for me." "You don't understand," Sterling pressed, taking a step forward. "Your father's will mandates that all living heirs must be physically present for the reading. If you do not attend, the estate will be tied up in probate court for years. Furthermore," Sterling paused, looking slightly uncomfortable. He left specific instructions. "There is an item that must be handed to you directly in the presence of the other beneficiaries. Tomorrow at noon. Greenwich." Sterling placed a thick ivory envelope on the greasy workbench. "A plane ticket, a hotel reservation, and a stipend for your time. Be there, Caleb, for your own sake." Without another word, the lawyer turned and walked back to his Mercedes, leaving Caleb staring at the ivory envelope as if it were a live grenade. The drive back to Connecticut felt like a descent into a forgotten purgatory. Caleb didn't use the plane ticket. Instead, he drove his battered, heavily modified 1998 Ford pickup up the East Coast. He wanted to feel the miles. He wanted his arrival to be on his own terms. When he pulled up to the formidable iron gates of the Harrison compound, the security guard, a new hire who didn't recognize him initially, refused him entry, eyeing the rusted truck with deep suspicion. Only after Caleb produced his driver's license and a curt phone call was made did the gates slowly swing open. Caleb parked his truck between a Bentley and a brand new Porsche 911 inches the circular driveway. He killed the engine, took a deep breath, and stepped out. He hadn't bought a suit. He wore a clean dark pair of jeans, a well-worn leather jacket, and heavy work boots. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who worked for a living. The heavy oak doors were opened by a maid. She led him through the grand foyer, the exact spot where he had been banished 10 years ago. The marble floors still gleamed. The enormous crystal chandelier still cast fractured rainbows across the walls. It smelled of expensive lilies and old money. He was directed to Richard's sprawling, wood-paneled library. Inside, the vultures were already circling. Sylvia sat on a velvet sofa, dressed in impeccable, tragic black. She looked remarkably well-preserved, though the surgical tightness of her face gave her a slightly feline appearance. Standing by the fireplace, sipping a glass of amber liquid, was Derek. The boy who had framed him was now a man of 26, tailored to perfection, with the arrogant, relaxed posture of someone who had never been told no in his entire life. Benjamin Sterling, the lawyer, sat behind Richard's massive desk, organizing stacks of legal documents. As Caleb walked in, the room's temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sylvia lowered her teacup, her eyes raking over Caleb's worn clothes with naked disgust. "Good Lord, they actually found you. I thought you would be in a penitentiary by now." Derek chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He swirled the liquor in his glass. "Look at him, Mother. The prodigal son returns, smelling like an oil spill. I hope you didn't track mud onto the Persian rugs, Caleb. They're antique." Caleb didn't take the bait. He didn't say a word to them. He walked past the sofa, ignoring Derek entirely, and stood directly in front of Sterling's desk. "Let's get this over with. I have a business to run." Sterling cleared his throat, implicitly commanding order in the room. "Thank you all for being here. As you know, we are here to execute the final will and testament of Richard Winston Harrison. I will dispense with the boilerplate legalities and get straight to the distributions." Sylvia leaned forward, her eyes glittering with barely concealed greed. Derek smirked, taking another sip of his drink. "To my wife, Sylvia Harrison," Sterling read, his voice monotone, "I leave the Greenwich estate, the properties in Aspen and St. Bart's, and the sum of $50 million from my personal accounts to maintain her standard of living." Sylvia let out a small, dramatic sigh, dabbing her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. "To my stepson Derek," Sterling continued, "I leave my controlling shares in Harrison Logistics effective immediately alongside the primary trust fund valued at $80 million. May he lead the company into the future." Derek pumped his fist slightly, a victorious grin breaking across his face. He looked at Caleb, his eyes mocking. He had won. He had taken everything. Caleb felt absolutely nothing. He hadn't expected a dime. He didn't want their dirty money. He just wanted the lawyer to finish so he could get back in his truck and drive south. And finally, Sterling said, the paper rustling in his hands. The lawyer looked up, his gaze fixing squarely on Caleb. There was a strange flicker of emotion in the older man's eyes. Pity? Anticipation? To my biological son, Caleb Harrison. Sylvia scoffed loudly. He disowned him. Legally, this is a farce. The disownment was a physical removal, Sylvia, not a legal severance of heirship, Sterling corrected sharply. He turned back to the document. Richard's addendum reads, to Caleb, who I exiled from this house, I leave no capital, no stock, and no real estate. Derek laughed out loud. Shocking. What do you get, Caleb? One of his old golf clubs? Sterling reached into his leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick, heavy envelope made of dark, heavy parchment stock. It was sealed shut with a thick blob of crimson wax, stamped with Richard's personal signet ring. He leaves you this, Sterling said softly. He stood up and handed the envelope to Caleb. The will explicitly states, Caleb is to receive this envelope. The contents within are his and his alone. He will know what to do with it. Caleb took the envelope. It was surprisingly heavy, feeling less like a letter and more like it contained a small book or a stack of rigid documents. An envelope? Sylvia sneered, standing up. What, did Richard write you an apology letter? How touching. You drove all the way up here for a piece of paper, Caleb. You can go now. The adults have business to discuss. Caleb didn't look at her. He stared down at the red wax seal. His heart was hammering against his ribs in a strange, arrhythmic tempo. Why would Richard go through the trouble of forcing him to come here just for a letter? The man didn't do apologies. He did calculated moves. Thank you, Mr. Sterling, Caleb said, his voice quiet. He turned on his heel and walked out of the library, leaving Sylvia and Derek to gloat over their millions. He didn't open it in the house. He didn't open it in the driveway. He got into his truck, locked the doors, and drove 2 miles down the road until he reached a quiet, empty park overlooking the Long Island Sound. He cut the engine. The silence in the cab was deafening. Caleb stared at the envelope for a long time. His thumb traced the embossed crest in the red wax. With a deep breath, he broke the seal. Inside, there was no emotional letter. There was no apology. There was a single metallic key, intricately cut and stamped with a sequence of numbers, 774B. Wrapped around the key was a small, handwritten note on heavy cardstock. The handwriting was jagged, sharp, and unmistakably his father's. It read, they think they took everything. They are fools. They don't know about the shell company. They don't know about the Swiss reserves. The company Derek inherited is rotting from the inside, drowning in debt I hid from the board. He will be bankrupt in 6 months. You were the only one who wouldn't lie for me. You were the only one who couldn't be bought. That's why I had to send you away to see if you could survive without the safety net. You did. The key is to a private vault in Manhattan. Inside are bearer bonds, offshore account codes, and the true deeds to the empire. It's worth over $300 million. Burn this note. Destroy them. Build something better. Caleb sat in the silence of his rusted truck, the key cold and heavy in his calloused palm. The rain began to fall against the windshield, mirroring the night he had been cast out. But this time, he wasn't shivering. He looked at the key. The game wasn't over. It had just begun. The drive from the Connecticut coastline to the heart of lower Manhattan was a blur of flashing taillights and relentless rain. Caleb's mind was a storm of its own, trying to process the magnitude of the note burning a hole in his jacket pocket. $300 million. It wasn't just wealth. It was a weapon. And his father from beyond the grave had handed it to him, loaded and off the safety. By early Thursday morning, Caleb's rusted Ford pickup was parked in a subterranean garage off Wall Street. He walked 2 blocks through the biting wind to the address discreetly etched on the back of the key, Kensington and Croft Secure Depositories. It didn't look like a bank. It was a brutalist block of windowless gray stone with a set of heavy, unmarked bronze doors. Inside, the lobby was a cathedral of absolute silence, lined with black marble and guarded by men in tailored suits who carried themselves with the distinct, terrifying stillness of ex-military operatives. Caleb approached the polished mahogany reception desk. He didn't look like the usual clientele. His boots were scuffed, his hands were calloused, and his leather jacket smelled of motor oil. The concierge, a severe-looking woman with wire-rimmed glasses, looked at him with a practiced, icy, polite indifference. May I help you, sir? Caleb placed the heavy brass key, number 774B, onto the marble counter. The woman's demeanor instantly shifted. The polite indifference vanished, replaced by a rigid, almost fearful deference. Right away, sir. If you would please follow Mr. Hayes. A heavily built guard escorted Caleb through 2 sets of biometric steel doors, down a private elevator that descended deep beneath the bedrock of Manhattan. and into a sprawling, climate-controlled vault that smelled of ozone and old paper. The guard pointed to a wall of brushed steel boxes and stepped back, giving Caleb total privacy. Caleb found 774B. He slid the key into the lock. The tumblers fell with a heavy, satisfying clack. He pulled the long steel drawer out and carried it to a private viewing table. When he lifted the lid, he found no cash, no gold bars. Instead, the box was packed tightly with thick manila folders, a black leather-bound ledger, and several stacks of heavy watermarked paper. He picked up the first stack. They were bearer bonds. Caleb had read enough about corporate finance to know what they were: unregistered certificates of debt. Whoever physically held the paper owned the money. They were virtually untraceable. Each certificate in the stack was issued by the U.S. Treasury, and each was denominated at $100,000. There were hundreds of them, but it was the black leather ledger that held the true power. Caleb opened it, tracing his father's sharp, jagged handwriting. Richard Harrison had been a monster, but he was a terrifyingly brilliant one. For the last 5 years, sensing his own mortality and recognizing Derek's absolute incompetence, Richard had been systematically bleeding Harrison Logistics dry. He had taken out massive, high-interest loans against the company's core assets, funneling the cash into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Geneva accounts to which Caleb now held the sole access codes. Richard hadn't left Derek an empire. He had left him a hollow shell propped up by toxic debt. The $80 million trust fund Derek inherited was legally bound to the company's stock as collateral. When the hidden loans came due, the company's stock would crash, the creditors would trigger the collateral clauses, and Derek's trust would be completely liquidated to pay the corporate debts. Sylvia was in the crosshairs too. The ledger revealed that Richard had forged her signature as a co-signer on the company's most aggressive mezzanine loans. When Harrison Logistics defaulted, the banks wouldn't just take the company, they would seize the Greenwich estate, the properties in Aspen, and every dime of Sylvia's $50 million cash inheritance. They had been set up for total, catastrophic annihilation. Caleb closed the ledger. His father had orchestrated the perfect revenge, but Caleb needed an architect to execute it. He couldn't walk into a Wall Street bank with millions in bearer bonds smelling like a Baltimore mechanic without triggering federal investigations. He needed a proxy. 3 days later, Caleb sat in the plush, glass-walled office of Elias Montgomery, a senior partner at one of New York's most ruthless corporate restructuring firms. Montgomery was a shark in a three-piece suit, a man who specialized in hostile takeovers and corporate liquidations. Caleb placed a stack of bearer bonds worth $5 million onto Montgomery's glass desk as a retainer. Montgomery didn't blink. He calmly steepled his fingers, his cold blue eyes locking onto Caleb. "That is a very aggressive opening statement, Mr. Harrison. What exactly are we buying?" "We aren't buying anything yet," Caleb said, his voice flat and authoritative. "We are establishing a shell company. Name it Pendleton Acquisitions. You are going to act as my proxy. Over the next 3 months, you are going to systematically purchase the distressed debt of Harrison Logistics from their creditors. I want to own every loan, every bond, and every marker my father took out." Montgomery flipped open the ledger Caleb had provided. He scanned the numbers, his eyebrows slowly creeping upward. "This company is carrying over $200 million in hidden liabilities. It's a house of cards in a hurricane. If you buy this debt, and the company defaults, which it will, you become the primary creditor. You can seize the assets, liquidate the trust, and foreclose on the private estates tied to the loans." "Exactly," Caleb said. "And the current CEO? Derek?" Montgomery asked, a slow, predatory smile forming on his face. "Let him play CEO," Caleb said coldly. "Let him buy the yachts and throw the parties. Let him think he won. You just make sure that when the bottom falls out, Pendleton Acquisitions is the one holding the hammer." The next 4 months were a masterclass in hubris and destruction. Derek, drunk on his newly acquired power, treated Harrison Logistics not as a business, but as a personal ATM. He fired the veteran logistics managers who questioned his spending and replaced them with sycophantic friends from his Yale fraternity. He authorized the purchase of 2 private Gulfstream jets for executive travel and launched a massive multi-million-dollar rebranding campaign that the company simply didn't need. Sylvia was equally reckless. Believing herself entirely insulated by her $50 million inheritance, she embarked on a spending spree that made headlines in the local society pages. She completely gutted and renovated the Greenwich estate, purchased a fleet of exotic cars, and began hosting lavish, Gatsby-esque galas every weekend. They were dancing on the deck of the Titanic, completely oblivious to the iceberg looming in the dark. Back in Baltimore, Caleb lived exactly as he always had. He still woke up at 5 in the morning, he still wore his oil-stained jeans, he still managed the garage, though he had quietly paid off all of Arthur's medical debts and given his 3 mechanics massive raises. The only difference was the encrypted laptop sitting on the desk in the back office. Every evening, Caleb logged on and watched the inevitable collapse unfold in real time, orchestrated by Elias Montgomery. The first domino fell in late September. Harrison Logistics failed to deliver on a massive critical contract with a global retail giant due to a routing error made by one of Derek's newly appointed vice presidents. The retailer publicly pulled their contract. Wall Street noticed. Within 48 hours, Harrison Logistics stock plummeted by 22%. The drop in stock value triggered an automatic covenant in the company's hidden mezzanine loans, the very loans Caleb now owned through Pendleton Acquisitions. Elias Montgomery called Caleb on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The threshold has been breached, Caleb. They missed their quarterly revenue targets by 40%. The creditors are panicking. It's time to call the debt. Do it, Caleb said, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. Call it all. Every cent. The strike was swift, legal, and brutally merciless. On Wednesday morning, Derek was nursing a hangover in his corner office overlooking Manhattan when his chief financial officer burst into the room, pale and sweating. We just received notices of default from 3 different holding companies, the CFO stammered, throwing a thick stack of legal documents onto Derek's desk. They're calling the loans Derek. All of them. Immediately. Derek rubbed his temples, annoyed. What loans? Just pay them out of the operating budget. You don't understand, the CFO said, his voice rising in panic. These are mezzanine loans taken out by your father years ago. They total over $250 million. We don't have the cash. The operating accounts are overdrawn from your jet purchases. If we don't satisfy this debt by Friday, they are going to trigger the collateral clauses. So use my trust fund, Derek yelled, standing up. The trust fund is the collateral, the CFO shouted back. And because the stock tanked yesterday, the trust doesn't cover the balance. We're insolvent, Derek. The company is bankrupt. Derek felt the blood drain from his face. He scrambled for his phone and called his mother. In Greenwich, Sylvia was sipping mimosas with her interior designer when her phone rang. Before Derek could even explain the corporate disaster, Sylvia's personal banker was on the other line, frantically beeping in. Mrs. Harrison, the banker said, his voice shaking. I'm calling to inform you that your personal accounts have been frozen by federal order. Sylvia dropped her crystal glass. It shattered on the newly installed Italian marble floor. Frozen? On whose authority? I have $50 million in that account. There are cross-default liens attached to your social security number, ma'am, the banker explained. You co-signed several corporate loans for your late husband. Because Harrison Logistics is in default, the creditors have legally seized your liquid assets to cover the shortfall. Furthermore, a notice of foreclosure has just been filed on the Greenwich property. In the span of 48 hours, the illusion of the Harrison empire completely evaporated. The bank seized the private jets. The $80 million trust fund was legally drained to zero to satisfy a fraction of the corporate debt. Sylvia's bank accounts were locked, her credit cards declined at high-end boutiques, and federal marshals arrived to place padlocks on the gates of the Aspen and St. Bart's properties. Desperate, humiliated, and backed into a corner, Derek and Sylvia demanded an emergency meeting with the faceless entity that had bought their debt and destroyed their lives. Pendleton Acquisitions. The meeting was set for Friday afternoon in the grand boardroom of Harrison Logistics. Derek paced the length of the room, his designer suit looking slightly rumpled, his arrogance entirely replaced by frantic anxiety. Sylvia sat at the mahogany table, looking 10 years older, her hands trembling as she clutched a cheap, generic handbag. We can negotiate, Derek kept repeating, more to himself than to his mother. We offer them equity, we restructure. We just need to talk to the CEO of this Pendleton group. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom clicked open. Elias Montgomery walked in first, impeccably dressed, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. He walked to the head of the table and began laying out foreclosure documents and liquidation orders. You must be the head of Pendleton Acquisitions, Derek said, rushing forward with false bravado. Listen to me. We can make a deal. I am the CEO of this company, and I am not the head of Pendleton Acquisitions, Montgomery interrupted smoothly, not even looking up from his papers. I am merely the legal counsel. The majority shareholder and your new senior creditor is here to oversee the liquidation of your assets personally. Montgomery stepped aside. Through the doorway walked Caleb. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore the exact same worn leather jacket, the same dark jeans, and the same scuffed work boots he had worn to the will reading. He looked calm, grounded, and entirely immovable. Derek stopped dead in his tracks. His jaw slackened. The color completely vanished from his face. Caleb, what are you doing here? Security! Who let him in? Sylvia let out a strangled gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. Her eyes darted from Caleb to Elias Montgomery, the horrific realization slowly dawning on her. No, that's impossible. Richard left you nothing. A piece of paper. Caleb walked slowly to the head of the table. He looked down at the sprawling skyline of Manhattan through the floor-to-ceiling windows, then turned his gaze back to the two people who had thrown him away like garbage. He left me a key, Caleb said, his voice quiet, echoing like thunder in the silent boardroom, and a warning that you two would burn this company to the ground. I just provided the gasoline. Caleb placed both hands firmly on the polished mahogany table, leaning forward. You framed me for your mistakes, Derek, Caleb said, his eyes locking onto his stepbrother. And you, Sylvia, you smiled, while a 16-year-old boy was thrown onto the street in a thunderstorm. You thought you won. You thought you were untouchable. Caleb tapped the stack of liquidation papers Montgomery had prepared. Pendleton Acquisitions now owns 94% of Harrison Logistics' debt, Caleb stated coldly. We own the lien on the Greenwich estate. We own the rights to your frozen bank accounts. As of 9 o'clock this morning, you are both officially bankrupt. Derek stumbled backward, collapsing into a leather chair. He looked like a little boy who had just been slapped. Caleb, please. We're family. You can't do this. I'll lose everything. You already lost it, Caleb replied, his voice devoid of any sympathy. You lost it the second you took the keys to that, Shelby. You just didn't pay the bill until today. Caleb turned to Montgomery. Elias, finalize the foreclosures. Evict them from the Greenwich property by Monday morning. If they take so much as a silver spoon, have them arrested for theft of corporate assets. Understood, Mr. Harrison, Montgomery said, clicking his pen. Caleb didn't wait for their tears or their screaming. He turned his back on them, walked out of the boardroom, and headed toward the elevator. He had a long drive back to Baltimore, and he had a garage to run. The aftermath of the corporate slaughter was a spectacle that the financial world would dissect for years. Within a month, the name Harrison Logistics was completely erased from the New York Stock Exchange. The company was delisted, disassembled, and sold off in pieces by the bankruptcy courts, with Pendleton Acquisitions holding the undisputed master claim. Sylvia Harrison fought tooth and nail. She hired a team of desperate, aggressive litigators to challenge the cross-default liens, claiming fraud and psychological manipulation. But the paperwork Richard had engineered was airtight. When a federal judge in the Southern District of New York finally threw out her last appeal, the reality of her new life crashed down upon her. The Greenwich estate was foreclosed upon and sold to a tech billionaire at auction. Sylvia was forced to relocate to a modest two-bedroom apartment in Queens, her socialite friends instantly abandoning her the moment her credit cards were declined. Derek's descent was even steeper. Stripped of his trust fund, his title, and his identity, he tried to leverage his Yale connections to secure an executive position at other firms. But Wall Street is a small town, and the stench of his massive public failure clung to him like a shroud. No reputable firm would touch him. He had no actual skills, no work ethic, and an ego that made him impossible to hire for entry-level work. While his former family was violently adjusting to poverty, Caleb returned to Baltimore. He had over $300 million sitting in diversified offshore accounts managed by JP Morgan, Chase, and Vanguard. He could have bought an island. He could have moved to Monaco. Instead, he drove his rusted 1998 Ford pickup back to Arthur's garage in the industrial district. The wealth didn't change him, because Caleb had learned a fundamental truth that Derek and Sylvia never grasped. Money wasn't a personality. It was just a tool. His first act as a multimillionaire was to completely quietly revitalize the neighborhood that had kept him alive. He set up a blind trust managed by Elias Montgomery and a senior forensic accountant named David Rosenthal. Through this trust, Caleb purchased the entire decaying city block surrounding the garage. He didn't build luxury condos or trendy coffee shops. Instead, he broke ground on the Arthur Pendleton Institute of Mechanical Trades, a massive, state-of-the-art vocational school designed to teach at-risk youth the skills of welding, automotive repair, and advanced machining. Tuition was completely free for anyone who could prove they had nowhere else to go. It was during the construction of the institute that Caleb met Rachel Dempsey. Rachel was the lead architectural engineer contracted for the project. She was a no-nonsense woman with sharp green eyes, hands calloused from years on construction sites, and a fierce dedication to urban renewal. She didn't know about Caleb's billions. She only knew him as the quiet, broad-shouldered mechanic who owned the local garage and had somehow secured the funding for the school. They bonded over blueprints, cold coffee, and a shared contempt for corporate bureaucracy. Rachel saw past the grease and the guarded exterior, recognizing the profound, quiet intelligence that Caleb possessed. For Caleb, Rachel was the first person since Arthur who looked at him and saw a partner, not a target. As the institute neared completion, a final unexpected twist emerged from the ashes of his father's empire. David Rosenthal, the forensic accountant, requested an urgent in-person meeting. He arrived at the Baltimore garage on a freezing morning in late November, carrying a heavily encrypted hard drive and a look of deep unease. "We were finalizing the repatriation of the funds from the Geneva accounts," Rosenthal explained, sitting on a folding chair in Caleb's cramped back office. "We found a secondary vault. It wasn't listed in the primary ledger your father left you. It required a specific biometric authorization, which we were able to bypass using the legal death certificates and your primary executor status." Caleb wiped his hands on a rag, his jaw tightening. "What was in it? More debt?" "No," Rosenthal said quietly. "A video file. And a series of legally binding corporate charters." Rosenthal opened his laptop, connected the drive, and turned the screen toward Caleb. The video began to play. Richard Harrison appeared on the screen. He looked gaunt, pale, and remarkably frail, clearly filmed in the final stages of his failing health. The imposing titan of industry was gone, replaced by an old man staring into the lens with cold, calculating clarity. "If you are watching this, Caleb, then you played your part perfectly." Richard's recorded voice rasped through the laptop's tinny speakers. "You burned them down. I knew you would. You have my ruthlessness, but you have your mother's sickening sense of morality." Caleb stared at the screen, his chest tight. "I built an empire of dirt," Richard continued, coughing into a handkerchief. "I crushed good people to get to the top. Derek and Sylvia were parasites who deserved to be buried in the ruins of it. But I realized, too late, that leaving a legacy of ashes isn't enough to secure a name in history. The secondary corporate charters in this vault contain the deeds to a holding company I established 10 years ago. It owns thousands of acres of undeveloped, resource-rich land in the Pacific Northwest, entirely disconnected from Harrison Logistics." Richard leaned closer to the camera, his eyes burning with a strange, dark intensity. "I didn't just leave you a weapon to destroy them, Caleb. I left you the foundation to build something that actually matters. The land is worth another $200 million. Use it. Build the manufacturing empire I was too busy playing Wall Street games to create. Show them what a real Harrison can do when he isn't suffocated by fools." The screen went black. Caleb sat in the silence of the garage, the hum of the space heater the only sound. His father was a monster, a manipulative sociopath until the very bitter end. Richard hadn't loved Caleb. He had simply recognized Caleb as the only competent piece on his chessboard. But as Caleb looked out the window of his office, watching the construction crews putting the finishing touches on the Arthur Pendleton Institute, he realized he didn't care about his father's twisted motivations anymore. The money was his. The land was his. And he would use it exactly the way Arthur would have wanted. 5 years passed. The world forgot about the spectacular collapse of Harrison Logistics. In its place, a new, quiet titan emerged in the industrial sector, Pendleton Heavy Industries. Caleb had utilized the undeveloped land in the Pacific Northwest to build a network of eco-conscious manufacturing plants. He produced high-grade, American-made steel, advanced agricultural machinery, and specialized automotive components. Unlike his father, Caleb refused to take his company public. He kept it entirely privately held, ensuring that he never had to answer to a board of greedy shareholders. He paid his workers double the industry standard, he offered full pensions, comprehensive healthcare, and a strict 40-hour workweek. His factories became the gold standard for blue-collar employment in the country. He was worth over $1 billion, yet his face had never graced the cover of Forbes. He actively avoided the press, fiercely protecting his privacy. He had also married Rachel. Their wedding wasn't held in a Greenwich mansion or a five-star hotel in Manhattan. It was held in the courtyard of the Arthur Pendleton Institute, surrounded by the first graduating class of student mechanics, local Baltimore business owners, and Elias Montgomery, who had become a trusted, albeit highly cynical friend. Caleb's life was full. The gaping, bleeding hole his family had torn into him at 16 had been entirely healed by the family he had chosen for himself. The final chapter of his past closed on a snowy Tuesday evening in December. Caleb was in Chicago doing a surprise inspection of a new Pendleton shipping hub on the outskirts of the city. The snow was falling heavily, blanketing the industrial park in pristine, quiet white. He was wearing his heavy Carhartt jacket and work boots, walking across the icy loading dock with the local foreman. "We're running slightly behind on the outbound freights, Mr. Harrison," the foreman explained, pointing to a line of idling delivery vans. "The storm slowed down the third-party courier services we contracted for the final mile deliveries." "Don't push them," Caleb said smoothly, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "Safety over speed. If the packages are late, we eat the cost and apologize to the clients. Nobody risks their life on black ice for a profit margin." "Understood, boss," the foreman smiled. As Caleb walked down the steps of the loading dock, heading toward his rented SUV, one of the third-party courier vans pulled up to the security gate. The driver stepped out to scan his manifest. Caleb stopped dead in his tracks. The snow seemed to freeze midair. The driver was hunched against the biting wind, wearing a cheap, thin, corporate windbreaker that offered no protection against the Chicago winter. He looked 10 years older than his actual age of 31. His hairline was receding, his face was lined with deep, permanent exhaustion, and his eyes carried a hollow, defeated emptiness. It was Derek. The golden boy of Greenwich, the heir who had once sipped scotch in a tailored suit while sneering at Caleb, was now working a brutally grueling, low-wage job just to survive. He was hauling boxes, the exact foundational labor that had built the empire he had squandered. Derek slammed the back doors of the van shut and turned around. As he did, his gaze swept across the loading dock and locked onto Caleb. For a long, agonizing moment, neither man moved. The howling wind was the only sound between them. Derek's hands tightened around his digital scanner. A flicker of recognition crossed his weary face, instantly followed by a wave of profound, crushing shame. He looked down at his cheap boots, then looked up at the massive glowing sign above the warehouse, Pendleton Heavy Industries. Derek slowly connected the dots. He realized who owned the facility. He realized who he was delivering packages for. Caleb didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He didn't walk over and demand an apology for the night he was thrown into the rain 15 years ago. The anger that had once driven him was completely gone, replaced by a quiet, absolute indifference. Derek wasn't a monster to be slain anymore. He was just a broken man serving out a life sentence of his own making. Caleb gave Derek a single curt nod of acknowledgement. Derek swallowed hard, his breath trembling in the cold air. He returned the nod, a slow, defeated dip of his head. He climbed back into his freezing van, put it in gear, and drove out into the snowstorm, disappearing into the dark. Caleb watched the taillights fade, then turned and walked to his car. He pulled out his phone and dialed Rachel's number. She answered on the second ring, the sound of their 2-year-old daughter babbling happily in the background. "Hey," Rachel's warm voice filled the car. "Did you finish the inspection? Are you coming home?" Caleb smiled, the tension melting from his shoulders. "Yeah. The inspection is done. Everything is exactly where it needs to be." "Good. Be careful on the roads. It's snowing hard here." "I will," Caleb said softly. "I love you. I'm coming home." He hung up the phone, started the engine, and drove toward the airport. He left the past buried in the snow. He had been disowned at 16, stripped of his name, and thrown to the wolves. But the wolves hadn't eaten him. They had taught him how to survive. And from the ashes of a shattered dynasty, he had built a legacy of iron that would stand long after the name Harrison was forgotten. Did this story of betrayal, vengeance, and ultimate redemption keep you on the edge of your seat? Caleb's incredible journey from a destitute teenager thrown into the streets to a self-made titan of industry who masterfully turned the tables on his toxic family proves that true wealth isn't what you inherit, it's what you build from the ground up. If you love the calculated twists, the dramatic downfall of Derek and Sylvia, and Caleb's rise to the top, please hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who loves a brilliant revenge plot, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, real-life dramas just like this one. Drop a comment below telling us what you would have done if you inherited that sealed envelope,